Marguerite was born in Angoulême, in the southwest of France, on the 11th of April 1492. She was the daughter of Charles, the Count of Angoulême, and Louise of Savoy. Henry VIII was born the previous year on the 28th of June, so they were of a very similar age. Marguerite and her parents later moved to Cognac, 30 miles away. And a little over 2 years later, on the 12th of September, Marguerite's brother Francis was born. Less than 4 years after he was born, Francis became next in line to the throne, because, so the story goes, the reigning king, young Charles VIII, was on his way to watch a game of real tennis and whacked his head by accident on a low door lintel. He is said to have continued on to watch the game, but on his way back collapsed and later died. He died childless, and so it was that the next in line was the Duke of Orleans, who became King Louis XII at the age of 32. Louis in 1498 had no children. That's not to say, not to predict at that point, at the turn of century, that he would never have children. But there was a real risk that he could die childless, or he could die without a male heir. Prudently, maybe, he summoned Francis, Marguerite and their parents to live close to him. They essentially became subservient to the new king. The family were moved from Cognac to the royal palaces at Blois and Amboise, and guardians were appointed for the children. However, notwithstanding these appointed guardians, Louise maintained her overarching influence over Marguerite and Francis. Now, if King Louis were to have a male child, then Francis would drop in the pecking order, and for every male child that Louis produced, he would drop another place. So, he and his family could never be absolutely sure, literally until Louis died, and beyond even that, as it turned out, that he would be King of France. Marguerite, despite being the older of the two, as a woman in France was prohibited by the law of the kingdom from inheriting the throne. Louise, however, pressed ahead, had her son educated just as an heir presumptive would be educated. But it was not just her son's education that Louise directed. Marguerite was treated on equal terms with her brother, and she too received an education fit for a monarch. Marguerite could never be sovereign of France, at least not by title she couldn't. Could it be, though, that the king's sister's acumen, decision-making and statecraft could surpass that of her brother? Whatever the answer to that may be, life continued on in the Loire Valley. King Louis did have children, but they were female, Claude and Renée. There was no male heir. In 1514, Francis married the older daughter, Claude. In the same year, King Louis took another wife, Princess Mary, the 19-year-old sister of Henry VIII. If Francis were to lose his claim to the throne, it would be now or never. Well, it was never, because Louis, some rather naughty people claim, died on New Year's Day as a consequence of the aged king's efforts to father a son with a 19-year-old woman. Which surely can't be true. Mary was obliged to remain in France for a decent, shall we say, respectable amount of time, just to make absolutely sure she wasn't pregnant. She wasn't. Charles Brandon whisked her back to England and married her on the way home for himself. When she had arrived from England earlier that year, Mary had brought with her a great retinue of ladies for company, most of which now made their way back to England. One of them in particular, however, a certain Anne Boleyn, or as I prefer to call her, Anne de Boleyn, remained in France. Francis's wife, Claude, was a loyal and faithful wife. She spent most of the rest of her short life in pregnancy. It might not be an exaggeration to say she spent all but a few days of the rest of her life being pregnant. Claude was cursed with a curved back, and given the circumstances, endless pregnancies and disability, the poor unfortunate woman played little part in the affairs of state. Part of the Queen was played, almost usurped, by the King's sister, Marguerite. And here I quote from the Cloquelane biography titled Margaret of Navarre. She later became Queen of Navarre, and it says, "Both sister and brother had been carefully educated by their mother for the roles they would now play. But of the two, it was Marguerite who was the most cultivated, who possessed the subtler intelligence and deeper understanding of the intellectual currents of the time. The woman, Marguerite, who took her place at the king's side, was every bit his equal in looks, spirit, and bearing." It was Marguerite, then, not Queen Claude, who accompanied Francis to Rheims, and in January 1515, in the cathedral there, he was crowned King of France. In June that year, Francis was off over the Alps to that flashpoint that we've covered in previous episodes, with an all-powerful army to reclaim the Duchy of Milan. He spectacularly defeated a papal army of Swiss mercenaries and followed that up by giving the Pope a bloody stiff talking to, and so renegotiated the terms of his kingdom's relationship with the papacy. They confirmed the agreement in the Concordat of Bologna, sealed in 1516. In a significant submission by the Pope, Francis was permitted to appoint his own senior clergy. Yes, the Pope could reject his submission and Francis would have to find a substitution, but the substitution was of Francis's choice, and Francis's choice only. It was Marguerite, however, who was the real driving force behind the reform movement in France. To a large extent, she founded it. With a change in the rules for the provision of senior clergy, Marguerite held much sway in the appointments, including the new Bishop of Meaux, William Brunetet. One of Marguerite's literary works was a collection of short stories which were compiled into a book called the Heptameron. Within these short stories, she attacked the morality and ignorance of the clergy with quite some venom. Singled out to receive the wrath of her pen were bishops who flaunted their mistresses in public. Catholicism, of course, demanded bishops be celibate. She included priests in her book who fathered children and committed incest, abbots and indeed abbesses who sexually abused those in their charge, and the itinerant friars who raped and murdered as they travelled from place to place. Marguerite became a patron and protector of the so-called Circle of Meaux, an influential group of would-be religious reformists. This was a pretty radical group for its time, which is why I refer to her as a protector, and there were many in the conservative French church who would have gleefully seen the organisation disbanded and its adherents punished, probably for heresy. But as the king's sister, Marguerite carried quite a lot of clout. A reformer she certainly was, but it's important to be clear that a break from Rome altogether, a rejection of papacy, would have barely crossed her mind. Indeed, it probably never did cross her mind. She had precious little respect for the Italian families who all too often provided a pope for Christendom. But a French separation from the papacy never ever made it onto her agenda. Like Erasmus and many Christians of the time, she recognised the problems within the church, and as we have seen, wrote about them in strong critical terms. She was an evangelist of the time and wholeheartedly supported the translation of the Bible into French. The Bible was the basis for teaching Christianity. For example, she helped to combat the medieval superstitions, which showed little respect for God. There were monastic abuses aplenty, but any notion of dissolving them, well, no such notion existed. They needed reforming, but reforming from within. Was it not her protégée, Anne de Boleyn, who exposed the fake relics at Hales Abbey in 1535? Was it not her protégée, Anne de Boleyn, who resisted the closure of the monasteries in England? Was it not her protégé, Anne de Boleyn's almoner, John Skipp, who spoke out for her against ravaging the church to satisfy greed? Action surely inspired by Anne de Boleyn's time in France with Marguerite. In the 1520s, Marguerite was not just supporting change but driving it. To the established church, it must have seemed to them appalling in the extreme. However, on the grand scale of what did happen later to Christendom, the violent divisions between Catholic and Protestant, Marguerite was the persona of pragmatism. Indeed, the young Princess Elizabeth, Anne de Boleyn's daughter, before she became queen a few years after her mother's execution, translated a substantial portion of Marguerite's religious work from French into English. Were then the seeds of Anglicanism sown by the sister of the King of France, the via media, the middle way, that Queen Elizabeth I and William Cecil developed during the latter half of the century? Was Anne's mentor the unwitting founder of Anglicanism? But to return to the aftermath of Pavia. Thousands lay dead, 12,000, maybe more. It was the biggest slaughter of French nobility since Agincourt. Countless more were taken prisoner, many held for ransom. Francis's mother and sister were distraught, and Louise showed some signs of anger. How many times did I warn him? He refused to believe me. She had obviously told him about the risks he was taking in the venture. in a letter to Montmorency, who had been held prisoner with her brother, Marguerite vented her frustrations at him. "All my life," she wrote, "I will envy you because I cannot perform for him, Francis, the duties you are now performing. For although my will to do so is greater than yours, it is impossible, since fate has wronged me by making me a woman." Francis has been taken first to Genoa and then from there by ship to Barcelona. After a few weeks there, then to Valencia. Along the way he was treated as a great celebrity, drawing crowds of thousands. Legend had it that the King of France could cure the sick. Eventually in July he was moved to Madrid. Negotiations for his release had thus far floundered. Well, they'd never really got off the ground. Charles demanded from Francis that he give him the Duchy of Burgundy, as well as the duchies of Artois and Provence. For the King of France, despite the fact that he was in prison, that was far too high a price to pay. Time lingered, the stalemate continued. Francis needed help to extricate himself and his kingdom from this terrible mess. For that help he wrote home. The help he wanted was from his sister. Marguerite tarried not in her preparations to leave the Loire Valley and set out for Madrid. She would try to rescue herself, her incarcerated brother. She hoped some way, somehow, to find a way of bringing him home. In mid-July, she received the Emperor's safe conduct to allow her to travel, and set out for Spain. She too arrived through the port of Barcelona. Like her brother, she received a rapturous welcome. But not all was good. En route to Madrid, news reached her that Francis had fallen gravely ill. She rode on and on, ever more determined, covering 40 miles or more a day, and again she wrote to Francis. "I can't tell you," she wrote, "how joyous I am to draw near the place I so desire to be. Never did I know what a brother is until now, and never would I have thought I would love him so much." It is these letters at about this time, between brother and sister, that later raised suspicions of incest, not unlike those levelled at Henry VIII's second queen and her brother George Boleyn. It was now the 19th of September, and she was met by her brother's captor Charles, the King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. He was a man of 25 years of age, but with a much older head on his shoulders. He was serious, grave, deeply religious, and well, frankly, if you fancied a night out in Madrid to enjoy a little revelry, he would not be the first person on your list to party with. Indeed, he probably wouldn't make your list at all. However, the political commentators of the day were speculating that the best way to get Francis released, get himself out of the mire, was for Charles and Marguerite to marry. Yes, to become husband and wife, king and queen, emperor and empress. That didn't happen. The relationship between Marguerite and Charles never really did thaw. She did, however, nurse her brother back to health, and although she had no clear or obvious part in Francis's release, they must have discussed the plan and the duplicity that followed, because in the winter of 1524 she left for home, she left for France, ostensibly empty-handed, and on the face of it she'd endured a wasted trip. But she travelled slowly, very slowly, writing almost incessantly to Francis along the way, asking him if she should return to Madrid. Indeed, by the 23rd of December she'd only travelled as far as Narbonne, and she would spend Christmas there. Then, on the 14th of January 1525, Francis entered into the so-called Treaty of Madrid. He would, according to the treaty, give up his lands as Charles had demanded, and he contracted to marry Charles's sister, Eleanor. But the venom written into the deal, the performance guarantee, was that Francis would be exchanged in a heartless swap for his 2 sons, who would then become Charles's hostages. And so it was that Francis was released on the 17th of March on the border between France and Spain. Francis stepped over the border into his own kingdom, and his sons passed in the opposite direction into Spain. They were prisoners, and it would be more than 4 years before the boys, then aged 7 and 8, would come home. Why so long? Well, Francis had no sooner had a hot dinner, a bath, and a change of clothes than he ripped up the Treaty of Madrid, ripped it up into small pieces, and he threw it on the fire. After all, he claimed, he had signed it under duress, he'd signed it in captivity. The agreement was null and void. And to give gravitas to that proclamation, the Pope agreed with him, and so did the Republic of Venice, and so did the Republic of Florence, and so did the Republic of Genoa, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Navarre, and all important, Thomas Wolsey agreed. Likely with some cajoling from the Cardinal, they'd all had enough of the overbearing, overmighty, overblown Habsburgs. They all joined together and formed the League of... Well, it was supposed to be the League of London after Wolsey, but Francis got his way and named it after his birthplace, Cognac. And so it became the League of Cognac, which rather put Wolsey's nose out of joint. And he said, if you call it by that name, Cognac, I'm not signing it. And so he didn't. No matter, Wolsey's strop affected little, and the alliance held firm for some time. And so, Emperor Charles V had most of Christendom, including the Pope, well and truly against him. From Wolsey's point of view, then, with the French on side, and certainly with the Pope on side, things were looking up again for the Cardinal. It was just that Henry VIII had to be rid of his wife and daughter, Catherine and Mary, whose loyalty was far greater, so Wolsey thought, to Charles than it ever was to England. And he probably had a point. It probably was. But anyway, by now there was no love whatsoever lost between Catherine of Aragon and Thomas Wolsey. With the French brimming with appreciation for Wolsey's efforts and support on their behalf to have Francis released, now was a good time to push ahead with an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine and to seal the new alliance and friendship with France. He planned a marital union between Henry VIII and Marguerite of Angoulême. From Wolsey's point of view, what could be more perfect? Longland, the Bishop of Lincoln, had by now sold Henry the entire scheme. The scheme we are today so familiar with. Catherine had at Ludlow consummated her marriage to Henry's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. He had Henry reciting Leviticus in his sleep. By now, Henry could not wait to get rid of Catherine as quickly as he could. He would start all over again with a new wife. A wife with no connections to Ferdinand, Maximilian, Margaret of Austria, Charles, or any other person from that damned Habsburg dynasty. The Pope was with both England and France, and vehemently against the Habsburgs. Henry, so Wolsey convinced him, could sleep soundly in his bed, because the Cardinal would deal with everything. He would handle all the details in his usual smooth and efficient manner. As always, Henry, in confidence and naivety, left Wolsey to arrange everything. For Wolsey, those bad old days of rejection after Pope Adrian's death and his conniving to pull the rug out from under Brandon's feet at Montdidier must have seen a long way off. Wolsey, so he thought, had every reason to thank God for gifting him with such a bright and intelligent mind. He was a master of strategy, and the very embodiment of tenacity. No Holy Roman Emperor would stand in his way and deprive him of the papacy. And so now to the next stage of his devious plan to become Pope. He would complete an insoluble union with France, with King Francis's mother Louise of Savoy, and of course the third integral part of that trinity, Marguerite of Angoulême. It tripped off the tongue, Marguerite, Queen of England. But she never would be Queen of England, because to Wolsey's horror, by now she was Queen of Navarre. Yes, she had remarried, not to the King of England, but to the King of Navarre. Wolsey's vital French connection was in dire jeopardy. His king was ready and primed to shun Catherine of Aragon, to shun Catherine, Mary and the Habsburgs, and he intended to take the hand of French royalty in marriage. It was all going wrong. Again. So now what? Any ideas?